Welcome to Sunday's live cast. We're going to talk about the demonization of consciousness that has been a result of a certain type of Christianity. And we're going to look at the relatively sophisticated psychological techniques that were employed. And first of all, I want to talk a little bit about some of the misconceptions I noticed from last week's live stream. Some people took away from it that I was saying that I literally believed that there was a talking snake in the Garden of Eden, and that the situation was misinterpreted by Adam and Eve, who were actually there. And that's not what I was trying to communicate at all. What I was saying is that I do think that it's very possible from my own subjective experience, my own meditations and visions with entheogens, and also my studies in Gnosticism and the Western mystery tradition and the Western occult tradition, that the story is actually an allegory or a metaphor for an actual process that's described by a tremendous number of mystics before I ever encountered it in the works of other people. I had it very succinctly myself, and so this is one of the reasons that that I'm so convinced in the value of the Gnosis, because I've seen a lot of evidence that when people are not constrained by doctrine and they are sincere seekers, there's a tendency to come up with the same visions, the same creation mythos, or at least very similar. And so the Gnostic Heresy, which is one of the main subjects of this live stream, is it's one of the best illustrations that I've ever seen of how blatant and intentional these distortions can be, and these manipulations, and how easy it is to overlook them. And so the word gnosis, as I'm sure most of you are familiar, just means knowledge. So Gnostic heresy, even in and of itself, implies that knowledge is somehow some kind of heresy. And that's disturbing to me. But so last week in the Halloween live stream, I talked about how, certain, I guess, sects, you could say, of Gnostics had come to the conclusion that the serpent was actually telling the truth, and that it was actually Tetragrammaton or Elohim or Jehovah or Yahweh or whichever one of these names you want to use, and that's going to be important later. It was actually the sinister Demiurgos, and the logic was that he was basically threatening Adam and Eve under threat of violence to remain in ignorance. And the serpent came along and said, Elohim is lying, and if you eat of this tree, then you will know as Elohim knows, and verily thou shalt not die. And then they didn't die. And so whether this is all true or not, that is one of the interpretations or doctrinal positions that the early Gnostics took, that gave the Christians, or the church, I should say, rather, an excuse to start lighting them all on fire. But there's more, and I think that this is even more central to the reason why the Gnostics were persecuted. And I want to get into this in a little bit more detail later, but it seems like it bears at least mentioning that in 2013, Bible scholars discovered confessions from Romans describing how and why they created the Jesus myth. And since then, they've been able to trace every single event in the life of Jesus back to some other historical figure or mythological figure's life. It's a composite myth, and at this point, it's pretty much an absolute certainty that it was totally and completely fabricated by the Romans in order to, well, partly the Palestinians were expecting a warrior Messiah. And so the religion was literally designed to create pacifists and to make people easier to rule and to stop free thinking, basically, which again is implied in the whole Gnostic heresy. Were Gnostics around prior to? Well, it depends on what you mean by Gnostics. You know, there's Christian Gnostics, and then I've definitely seen the term pre-Christian Gnostics used, and the term can be used loosely, as I do. I'm definitely not a Christian Gnostic. I don't believe in any doctrine. The reason that I use the word and what I appreciate so much about it is that it is based on the idea that individually centered organic processes can result in authentic and genuine divine revelation, and that it is only through this sort of organic process that spiritual development really has any value. And this is one of the reasons that, you know, very early I became very suspicious of a lot of these religious systems, because I noticed that very often when people had experiences with entheogenic plants, or they committed to a strict regimen of meditation, or some kind of practice, even just, you know, very intense contemplation, and hopefully a combination of all of these things, there are certain characteristics that are developed. Tolerance of other people, a sort of a do as thou wilt and harm ye none kind of ethos, and general goodwill towards all other sentient life, not just humans, but animals and plants. And so these religious systems where people just adopt a doctrine, and there's really no process, there are no entheogenic plants, there is no meditation, there is nothing that actually catalyzes the expansion of consciousness and a deeper connection with the fundamental cycles of nature, for example. People that just adopt doctrines, you know, run into buildings with bombs strapped to them. They, you know, beat up gay people. Yeah, I mean, you guys know, like the United States, the lunacy that goes hand in hand with religion, and in the Middle East. And so when I talk about gnosis, what I mean is that individually centered organic development that does not come from doctrine. It doesn't mean that you don't read and research and study anything that you think you can draw from. When I was doing some research on this, actually, I ran into a quote, because, you know, Crowley and OTO and that whole world, they also call themselves Gnostics, but it's obviously not Christian Gnostics. So, but one of the things he said, somebody asked him, well, aren't you a Satanist? And he said, sure, but I'm also a Christian, a Buddhist, a Zoroastrian, whatever I can find that is of use, I will integrate. Discord server? I've never even heard of that. Okay. So we started talking about the Garden of Eden and the main threat to the church, which was that one of the almost universal doctrines of Gnostics has been that you do not need an intermediary. You do not need a scripture. You do not need a priest. You do not need a church. And this actually did not necessarily start the system of control and the sort of pyramid scheme that is applied to these religions. It's found in Judaism as well. And I only found this out relatively recently because, you know, as an initiate of the Hermetic Order of Golden Dawn and Freemasonry and other occult traditions, it was required of me to learn some basic Hebrew and to understand the Hebrew alphabet. And because, you know, nearly all of the, like when you perform the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, which is generally prescribed to, you know, your first year as a magician in any of the fraternities, all the god names are Hebrew, the archangels are Hebrew, the letters that are used on magical weapons and then the circles are Hebrew. So I had a relative that was an Orthodox Jew, and we were having dinner, and I just met him, and I thought that I could establish some common ground by, you know, showing off some of my knowledge of of Hebrew and Jewish mysticism, and he just stopped me and said, "Just I don't even want to know." And I was really surprised. And I was like, "Why?" And he said, "Well, it's forbidden to Jews for, I guess you would say, like lay Jews or non-rabbinical Jews to study the things of God directly." And I was left speechless because I thought, okay, in my decades of study, the most powerful and efficacious system of mysticism that I have come across, I mean, there's a reason why all these occult traditions have adopted Hebrew. I just couldn't believe it. It's like, this is the spiritual sustenance, the fruit of your tradition, and it's forbidden for you to see the proof of the divinity that is expressed in your tradition. But if you think about it, it's obvious why. If they were to allow the lay people to practice the deep mysticism, to know the secrets, to have their own direct conduit to divinity, you no longer need a rabbi. You don't need a synagogue. The collection plate is going to stop filling up. Okay. And so my point is that this did not start with the Christian tradition. This prohibition on direct access to divinity actually is found in Judaism as well. Okay, so now the demonization of consciousness, since we're kind of on track to get there. I know I talked about this a little bit last week, but don't worry, we're going somewhere new with it, but I do have to do some background in case there are viewers that weren't there. So one of the lesser known, I guess, the metaphysical process that lies behind the Lucifer myth. The idea is that there was nothing, and it became conscious, and that consciousness was manifested as light or by light. And the advent of something other than nothing created division, because now there's not just nothing, there's nothing and consciousness or energy or light. And so this idea of knowledge causing the fall, and that association with a demon of evil, even though it's not explicitly explained, I think that in our subconscious being, we recognize that. And I think also last week I forgot to mention that another element of the myth is that the mechanism that consciousness used to impose order upon this energy was a vibration. And that is why Lucifer was said to be the court musician, right? And the highest of the archangels, only because it was the first emanation, the thought. Ayahuasca at home, I'm not sure I'm following. Okay, and we're going to get more into that actually when we talk about the real symbolism of the all-seeing eye, what that means and what it implies. So what I was getting at there, in case it wasn't clear, is that whether implicit or not, the demonization of the serpent and the tree and Lucifer is all indirectly the demonization of consciousness and thought and awareness itself. And while we're on this subject, I mean, I know it's almost trite or cliche to even bother to point this out, but the demonization of nature that occurs in the Garden of Eden, I think that is a very overlooked, or that the consequences of this are very much overlooked. And I think it's definitely worth noting that at least, in America, where I'm from, North America, the type of Christianity that people generally practice, I guess, nature is kind of relegated to, it only has whatever value, or its value is determined by its utility to man, right? The animals were given to us to be used. The forests, pollution doesn't matter because we are here to consume what God has given us and then return to God. And so the way that rubs me wrong, I guess to put it mildly, is that in the older traditions, pretty much all indigenous traditions all over the world, and a lot of uh, pagan, I guess, and the really old traditions. The oldest known religion, I think, is panpsychism. The idea that everything is somehow fundamentally conscious, if to varying degrees. Um, it's like this form of Christianity has actually separated the divinity from creation, and I think that the way that these people behave, it definitely reflects that. Um, Yeah, and that's all been very deliberate. I mean, the way that the church draped the Christian religions over the old pagan sun worship. I mean, it's trite and cliche, but Jesus is clearly just symbolic of the sun who dies and is resurrected. It brings new life, with the light every morning, and birth and death all around solstices. Uh, it's We don't really need to go into it because we all know it, but I think that people do underestimate the impact of humanity, or so much of humanity, being separated from the old panpsychism and the pagan connection to the cycles of nature. And it's not just that the old ways were obscured or destroyed. The older traditions, people understood why these things were sacred. And for hundreds of years, I guess thousands now, it could actually get you killed in a lot of places to even discuss this stuff, until it's like the memory had been burnt beyond our power to even recall it. And so, I mean, it also, I think, can impact the way we even relate to each other. I mean, one of the most baffling aspects of all of this to me is that the God of the Jews had both masculine and feminine aspects. The Elohim is both masculine and feminine. The Tetragrammaton, the unspeakable name of God, also has masculine and feminine aspects or components. The Shekinah is basically the female aspect of God. So we have this androgynous being, and then we have adherents of religion that demonize androgynous people that you would think, and this is actually some North American Indian tribes or Native American tribes believed this as well, that the people that seem to express both sexes were more divine, they were holy, they were closer to divinity. Okay, so there's a lot of interesting parallels too with the Gnosis, and I've been doing some research and trying to figure out, because this is how it appears. Scholars over the years have noticed these connections to, or potentially to, Buddhist thought, to the secret mystical traditions of some of the Jewish sects, to the Pythagoreans, particularly the idea of the monad and how it became the dyad and divided from there, which was an incredible thing for me to read, by the way, because I actually had an ayahuasca vision where I saw that all happen with like this narrator explaining, this was nothing, and then it had a thought, and that divided it, and then this was male and female, and it was exactly the description that Pythagoras, and that it exists in some of the mystical Jewish traditions. I think even there are some Hindu mystics that seem to have alluded to it. Pythagoras It's very interesting to me that it seems likely that this stuff actually has just bubbled up into the minds of mystics all over the planets in different times. And the reason that I am explaining it in that way is that scholars have not managed to establish that these similarities in the creation myth, for example, in this metaphysical process of energy and consciousness, they have not been able to find causal connections or whatever. But they believe that it is just so improbable that there are all these similarities that they just insist that there must be one. And so I think either they are correct or it supports this idea that, you know, we all do know the truth and have some ability to access and connect to the truth. So I want to talk about the oppression of the church again, in reference to the virgin birth, because one of the creation myths, I guess, of shared by several sects of Gnosticism is that Sophia gave birth without her male counterpart to this monstrous Yaldabaoth, the Demiurgos, or some people say that it's Yahweh, right? But I would suggest that Gnostics were trying to avoid getting burned at the stake. And one of my interpretations from my studies of the New Testament is that it's actually describing Jesus as a false prophet that has come to deceive. So, what other story can you guys think of a virgin birth? Right. So, it really kind of seems to me that they were indirectly alluding to this idea that this was not a good prophet. And of course, I can't be sure about that, but it is awfully strange that the story of Sophia begetting the Demiurgos is nearly identical to the story of the Virgin Mary giving birth to Jesus. So, lots of interesting things to consider there. Okay, so the all-seeing eye, because I really want to, you know, talk about the demonization of consciousness itself. And you guys, again, I probably don't need to tell you this, but I've seen actual research that someone was trying to figure out, like, how many decades or centuries science was actually impeded by the influence of the Christian church. You know, like we would have been on the moon 50 years earlier. Um, the oppression of just the evolution of culture. Again, you know, I do want to move on, but we were talking about the pretty much the eradication of different pagans. You know, the Norse. There are black metal bands burning churches down up there because they're so angry that they have had their roots cut off from them by this religion that was created in order to justify slavery, in order to create pacifists, and to, I mean, you'll see, we'll get there. But the all-seeing eye, if you haven't studied the Western occult tradition, you might not be aware of this. But in Western magical practice, most, well, I shouldn't say most, but very common practice is to cast a circle around the magician that represents his microcosm. And his job basically is to determine and what he will keep out or even cast out of his circle. Another common practice is the congress with a demon, or to conjure a demon. And remember that in the original Greek, demon did not mean evil spirit necessarily. It could, but it just was a word for spirit. But at any rate, the triangle is said to, for whatever reason, constrain or hold the demon so that you can trap it to talk to it. And I should point out while we're on the subject that there is evidence that even, what would you say, like Middle Ages magicians, that we generally, in the modern scientific paradigm, think of as, you know, superstitious and ignorant, there is evidence that they actually consciously were aware that this could be nothing more than almost like a meditation or an exercise. And the idea is that if you are struggling with a vice like sex, or, you know, greed might be the best example, because greed constrained by reason and ethics can become ambition. So the idea is that you are transmuting, using alchemical thought, this lead into gold of higher purpose, higher consciousness. Um, so the eye in the triangle could be taken, interpreted as consciousness itself, conceived as a demon, and the implication being that only the elite at the top of the pyramid are actually awake and conscious, and they have constrained the entire society below them so that they are basically just materials to support them and to generate their pyramid, right? So again, ties right in to that whole concept of the demonization of consciousness, not just with the Lucifer myth, but also the plant itself. I mean, this idea that they somehow gain knowledge by consuming this plant, people forget that there is evidence that are solid. We know for sure, at least in Europe, and the Eleusinian mysteries, for sure, Plato and those guys has predated Christianity. People among the elites, in particular, have been using psychoactive plants, entheogenic plants, since before the time of Christianity. So the idea that they deliberately demonized that practice in the first book of the Bible that long ago is totally reasonable. So it's just incredible to me that the first book of the Bible kind of sets the stage for everything that would follow so succinctly. The demonization of nature. Okay, so we were talking about the virgin birth, and there's something I forgot. I was going to move right along, but not only is it creepy to me that the virgin birth and the Gnostic idea of the emanation of the demiurgos by Sophia. A lot of people don't know this, but in traditional, I guess, Orthodox Judaism, it is said that a virgin does not know God, because it was believed that at the moment of orgasm, we are as close to divinity as we are capable of being as mortals. And so, with the advent of the virgin birth, the implication became that sex was unholy. It was no longer a tool to become closer to God, right? And so, I mean, you know, Islam grew out of these same traditions and is influenced. So the practice of throwing acid in the face of women that are considered to be whores, and all of this other suppression and guilt and all of these complexes that have grown out of Christianity. You know, I just wanted to illuminate that, because it's not something that people are really aware of, that this tradition actually used to venerate sex and hold it sacred, and as actually a method of connecting with deity. And I think partly because the Roman consulate and the initiates and adepts that wrote the Bible actually knew the power and efficacy of sex magic to expand consciousness and to empower people, and uh, they were seeking to disconnect them from that, that this was an intentional demonization of every tool that they were aware of in order to pacify. Okay, so Now we're going to talk about the debunk of Christianity, and I'm going to use two different approaches. One is it's not really new news, but I think that people hesitate to talk a lot about this kind of stuff because, yeah, mutilation such as circumcision, um, well, that actually grew from Judaism, I think. And if we consider that hygiene may have been more confusing back then, that may actually have started out with less, that may have not really been rooted in suppression. But who knows? I mean, it certainly could have been. Okay, so as I was saying, this isn't um, really new news, but there's a Bible scholar, a group of Bible scholars, in 2013. They let's see, I pulled it up here so I could read a little bit of it. The New Testament was written by first century Roman aristocrats. They fabricated the entire story of Jesus Christ. His presentation. Okay, so he gave a presentation in uh, England somewhere. And he says, he was hesitant even to present this stuff because he didn't want to upset Christians. But, and I'm very much in alignment with this guy. Alert citizens need to know the truth about our past so we can understand how and why governments create false histories and false gods. They often do it to obtain a social order that is against the best interests of the common people. He asserts that Christianity did not really begin as a religion, but a sophisticated government project, a kind of propaganda exercise used to pacify the subjects of the Roman Empire. Jewish sects in Palestine at the time, who were waiting for a prophesied warrior Messiah, were a constant source of violent insurrection during the first century. When the Romans had exhausted conventional means of quashing rebellion, they switched to psychological warfare. They surmised that the way to stop the spread of zealous Jewish missionary activity was to create a competing belief system. That's when the peaceful Messiah story was invented. Instead of inspiring warfare, this Messiah urged the turn the other cheek pacifism and encouraged Jews to pay unto Caesar, to give unto Caesar, and pay their taxes to Rome. Um, he goes on to say that Jesus is the only fictional character in literature whose entire life story can be traced to other sources. Once those sources are all laid bare, there's simply nothing left. There's clear evidence of a deliberately constructed pattern. If you guys are curious about who, it looks like most of the sequence of events and locations of Jesus' ministry are the same as the sequence of events and locations of the military campaign of Titus Flavius, as described by Josephus. It's clear evidence of a deliberately constructed pattern. The biography of Jesus is constructed tip to stem on prior stories, but especially on the biography of a Roman Caesar. We have the evidence not to show exactly where the story of Jesus came from, although Christianity can be a comfort, or excuse me. What my work has done is give permission for many of those ready to leave the religion to make a clean break. We have got the evidence now to show exactly where the story of Jesus came from. Although Christianity may be a comfort to some, it is also very damaging and repressive, an insidious form of mind control that has led to blind acceptance of serfdom, poverty, and war throughout history. To this day, especially in the United States, it is used to create support for war in the Middle East. And so I will I'll put a link to that guy's work. I'm actually going to try to contact him and see if I can get him to come on the podcast, because I do actually think this is important. And you guys, I say this a lot, but I don't think there's a single word that is attributed to Jesus in the New Testament that I disagree with. That's not the point. That really isn't the point. I mean, Mr. Rogers taught all the same stuff, Sesame Street. I mean, the point is that people are still being suppressed. There are anti-environmental movements. I mean, think about that. Anti-environmental movements in the U.S. that are largely facilitated by this subconscious and even conscious belief that nature is just there for us to use, You know, I mean, I have definitely had many a conversation with Christians in the United States where I've said, well, don't you think that God just kind of exploded and is everything? I mean, if there's a God, you know, it's me, it's you, it's created this and us to experience through its own creation, because otherwise it would be sitting there in nothingness for all of eternity. And no, that's blasphemy. You know, you're not God, nature's not God, God is God, and everything else is just everything else. And I think, you know, the impact of that is not spirituality to me. That is false. That's a lie. That's deception. And I think this idea that, you know, people can believe whatever they want as long as they're not hurting any people is fine and well. But I don't think you can say that of religion in general. I mean, even Buddhism generally, you know, even though it's generally good, or at least harmless, I have definitely seen with my own eyes how it can become a trap, and people can become very depressed and detached and nihilistic. Um, so I'm just very strongly suggesting that spirituality is a real thing, that at least in my experience, there's something more to the universe than blind, deterministic, random, probabilistic gobbledygook. But doctrinal religion is an impediment to real spiritual experience and development. Okay, and so this is the last part of this live stream, but it might be the best part. So check it out. Tetragrammaton, the reason that curse words, four-letter words, are curse words is because the Jews believed that if you were to even accidentally pronounce the true name of God, the universe would be destroyed. Okay? So not only is it very strange that since Christianity grew out of Judaism, they insist, right? Jesus Christ is the name of God. And I always this is another thing I used to argue with them all the time about. Like, why do you think that? How does that make any sense? If the God is the all, then isn't it also like pine tree and chair and, you know, illuminostic and Buddha and whatever? What are you talking about? Why? How does this rationale make sense to you that it has to have this name? But they do. They insist. It's really important. You have to call him Jesus Christ. Otherwise, you're not saved and you're going to burn in hell for all of eternity. So, not only do the Jews have like dozens of names for God, because God is such a vast thing, is the idea that different aspects of God, you have to conceptualize them a little differently. So Adonai is like a masculine, fiery, it means Lord. Aheye is closer to androgyny. It means I am. The Elohim is the masculine and feminine, another masculine. You know, I could go on. There's Agalah. There's a whole bunch of different names. So all of a sudden, have to call him Jesus Christ. Here's the thing. Well, okay, yeah, yes, Yoshua, yeah. It means savior in Hebrew, basically. But either way, this point is still stands. If it's true that the true name of God, if spoken, would destroy the universe, Jesus Christ is not the true name of God, or it would destroy the universe when you said it. So, using their own doctrine, the people that believe the Bible to the letter have disproven themselves, completely destroyed, using nothing but their own doctrine. So thank you so much for watching, you guys. Please click the like button. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell notification. Support us on Patreon because we did get demonetized. Not sure why. But right on, you guys. Thank you so much for spending this time with me.